My name is Lars Hansen. I'm the research director for the Becker-Friedman Institute. This is the second installment of what we hope will continue over the next several years, under which some of the elite researchers around the world can become acquainted with the undergraduates here at the University of Chicago, which we know are the best in the world, I assume, as well. So it's good to it's good to certainly have this connection. So last time we heard from Jim Heckman, and today our privilege is to hear from Tom Sargent. Tom Sargent is the 2011 Nobel laureate, professor at NYU's Economics Department and Stern School of Business. He's a leading scholar in macroeconomics and has Chicago ties. He was a professor here between 92 and 98, and he's currently a Becker-Friedman Institute Distinguished Fellow. Moreover, Tom Sargent was Milton Friedman's colleague for many years at Stanford's Hoover Institution. So Tom Sargent's contributions to economic research have been wide-ranging. He's an innovator in developing and using state-of-the-art dynamic economic models to deduce formally the implied restrictions on economic time space data, examining or testing these restrictions using data. His resulting empirical analysis explored a wide variety of macroeconomic questions, including unemployment and inflation. And he's complemented his empirical focus with a willingness to explore a variety of current and historical evidence through the lens of alternative economic models, always with the purpose of understanding the ramifications for economic policy. Recently, he's turned his attention to the study of a history of the U.S. fiscal policy, similar in spirit to Friedman and Schwartz's classical study of the history on historical analysis of monetary policy. So I'm really looking forward to hearing a dialogue with Tom, and it's my pleasure to turn things over to Tom Sargent as well as to Will Burgoff, who I understand will be leading the questioning. I think we'll be in for some very insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
And I thought a great place to kind of start would be, I'm sure many of you read a couple months ago, he published an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was about kind of the Euro bailout, how it's going on now, and you compared it to one of the bailouts, or not bailouts, that we had in American history. So if you could give us a kind of an overview of that theory and where you think Europe's heading.
Okay, so I'm happy to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. Answer questions, or you can ask me questions. I'll ask you questions. So do you want to talk about the euro? Okay, so do you like U.S. history? Have you ever had U.S. history? Okay, so here's going to be my take. So I'll start talking about the euro. In a way, I'll talk about the euro. So there's this artist called René Magritte, and he has this famous painting. Okay, what it is, it's a pipe, and the title on the painting is "This is not a pipe." Okay, so I am not going to talk about the euro. So instead, I'm going to talk about something else. So actually, it's kind of rude for an American to talk about the euro, given how disorderly the fiscal and monetary policy my generation and Lars's generation and Grace's generation is handing over to you to straighten out. So I'll talk about America in the beginning and see if this reminds you of anything. So let me start near the beginning to now. So the United States, so there's going to be a theme in what I'm going to talk about. And it is fiscal crises often lead to political revolutions. And what a fiscal crisis is, a bunch of promises were made by the government, and they've got to be broken. And the question is, whose promises are going to be broken? And that, Milton Friedman used to say this. He used to say, big problems in the government, confronted by the government, are often resolved only when there's a crisis. And I know he had in mind that if you kind of look back in history and you look at big revolutions like the American Revolution and the French Revolution, they were preceded by fiscal crises. And you've heard of the guillotine? That was actually an instrument of fiscal policy. I talk about that later. Okay, so So go back to near the beginning. 1776, the United States is, the beginning of 1776, we're part of an empire that has obligations and privileges with Britain. And among the privileges, we're in a protectionist trade system where American merchants and American ships get some benefits. They get some subsidies from the British. Okay. We also had to pay some taxes to the British. Actually, if you go back and look at the taxes they wanted to collect, they weren't outlandish. But let's just leave that aside. But Americans, you've heard of the Tea Party. Some Americans don't like to pay taxes now, and some didn't then. So the ones who didn't then organized a revolution, and we had a 7 or 8 year war against the British. And what we did is we created 13 separate countries. There were the 13 original states, and they were sovereign states. And we created a constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which is different than the constitution we have now. So that constitution gave sovereignty to the 13 states, New York, Massachusetts, Georgia. 13 states, and those states were sovereign in the sense that they had the ability to regulate foreign trade, meaning foreign trade was Massachusetts trade with other places like Britain and New York. And they had the ability to impose the one tax that raised revenues in those days. It wasn't the income tax, it was a tariff. So this is a really poor country, like poorer than many African countries today, where the main source of revenues is tariffs, because that's where you can collect it. So those tariffs are under the control of 13 individual states. There's a central government, which is Ronald Reagan's dream. The central government is set up. It's designed institutionally to have so that it can't tax, spend, or borrow. And what I mean by that is the central government, called the Continental Congress, it didn't even have an executive branch. Didn't even have a judiciary. It's just a Congress. It has no ability to tax. What it can do is ask the states for revenues. And typically, the states provided a very small fraction of what they were asked. So how did the United States is this collection of 13 states. How did they, so this is a government with a very weak center and 13 sovereign states. By the way, do you know how, I'm not going to talk about the euro, but do you know how many states are on the euro? Sovereign states are on the euro? If you count the Vatican? 27. Okay. And they have a very weak center, too. Anyway, so how did the United States finance the war? So we didn't collect very many taxes, although at the end we did. I'll tell you about that. We basically borrowed, and so we issued debts. And if you go read, you can go look at these debt contracts. The United States is basically on a international currency system, and the currency in which these debts are denominated are dollars. So what's a dollar in those days? What a dollar is Spanish coin. It's a Spanish silver coin that's issued by Spain. So the United States sort of joined a currency union under the revolution. We didn't ask Spain's permission. They were happy to let us use these coins. Anybody could use these Spanish coins. They're denominated in silver. So if you read the debts that are issued by the U.S. government and the 13 states, they're denominated in silver coins, dollars. And who's buying these debts? About 2/3 of the debts issued by the central government, and another 1/3 is issued by the individual states. So you know what a bond is, right? A bond prod. So Lars has pushed our analysis of pricing of bonds and stocks to new levels. So what a bond is it's a promise of a stream of coupon payments and then a terminal payment. So it's a bunch of promises where the lenders gave the United States government something now in return for these promises. So the United States comes out of the war with huge debts. most of these debts are owed to American citizens. That's going to be important in my story. They're owed to American citizens in the various states. And about 10 or 15% are owed to French people and Dutch people. That's kind of the situation. Okay, so the war ends with victory in 1781 or 1783. And by the way, we also printed up a bunch of money, currency. Every state printed up money, the 13 states, and the central government printed up money. And this money just inflated. Okay. So you've heard the phrase, not worth a continental. By the end of the war, a continental dollar was worth less than a tenth of a penny. Essentially, it all became worthless. Okay, so the war's over, and the government has these debts. And how big were the debts? So some of you know this. So if you valued the debts at par, meaning if you took the promises at face value, the debt to GDP ratio was 40%. Okay. This is in a country that's terribly poor and wasn't even taxing. You know, the United States government today the federal government taxes about 18% of GDP. In those days, and our debt GDP ratio is about 60%. In those days, our debt GDP ratio is 40% at par. And the government was raising less than 1% of GDP in revenue. Less than 1%. Less than 0.5%. So guess what? These debts on the marketplace did not go at par. They went at deep discount. Okay, so here's a Hansen basic model of valuing sovereign debt, or any debt. Your debt. You take the present discounted value of the payments, so you've learned present value. By the way, present values, that's one thing you should know. Okay, so the simplest formula, what you're discounting is a perfectly known stream, but what if it's unknown? What you use is, instead of a regular discount factor, use a stochastic discount factor. Stochastic meaning random, you discount it for its randomness. Okay, and stochastic discount factor was big time in those days, so the debt's going at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. That's less than Greek, I said I wasn't going to talk about the euro. That's less than Greek debt is going, or Spanish debt. So the debt was going at deep discount. And that's the situation in the 1780s. Furthermore, one other situation in the 1780s. Under the Articles of Confederation, when we left Britain, they kicked us out of the British imperial system, and they just started discriminating against our trade. They imposed tariffs. They wouldn't let us trade in our own ships, and they're hammering us. So every founder or framer, Jefferson, Madison, all the guys who wrote letters, you read their letters, they say, this is deplorable, and we should retaliate against the British. So we should use trade restrictions against the British to retaliate against them. But the problem was, who's going to retaliate? There's 13 different states in charge of trade policy, and Massachusetts actually did try to retaliate. And guess what? Rhode Island said, this is great because all the trade that was going to Boston is going to go to Providence, and it did. So Providence defected. So there's a big free rider problem and a big coordination problem. So, you know, a Nash equilibrium, you know what that is. Boy, that was operating then. And Jefferson and Madison knew what a Nash equilibrium was. And so what they said is, what you have to do is you have to, you're not going to have voluntary coordination in trade policy. So what they wanted to do, they wrote these letters saying, we have to have trade policy at the center. But the Constitution prohibited that. And the Constitution, which they were sworn to protect, had amendments procedures which required unanimous consent of all the states to amend it. So there were attempts to amend it. Okay, so here's the situation. The debt's going at deep discount. The debt comes due and the interest comes due and the government doesn't pay it. So instead, I owe you interest. What I do is I issue a new IOU. So the debt's heading north. These promises, which aren't being kept, are being funded by new promises. Okay, that's it. So that's the situation. So the reason I said this is Ronald Reagan's dream is the question is this a fiscal crisis? Do you think this is a fiscal crisis? And if you go back in the 1780s, some guys said yeah, and some guys said no. The guys who said yes were the creditors of the government. And the creditors of the government, they wanted the promises to pay these debts to be kept. And you go to the Hansen pricing formula, how are they going to be kept? They're going to be kept if the government can somehow raise the taxes to service the debt. So from their point of view, it's a crisis. This is a government that can't tax enough to honor its promises. From the point of view of the taxpayers that don't own any debt, well, why'd they revolt against Britain? They wanted a central government that could not borrow, tax, and spend. And they had it. And anyway, who cares about paying these debts? You know, if your brother or you are in a Revolutionary War and you got shot through the arm and not paid very much, why should you pay some merchant who was sitting at home who lent the government money? Just call it a new deal and we'll start over with zero government debt. Sounds good to me. So paying this debt, there would have been winners and losers. So there were some guys who were perfectly happy with the old Constitution, and there were some guys who didn't like it. That's the situation in 1780, 85, 86, 87. So this is going to sound Marxist, and I'm not a Marxist. And it's going to actually sounds like an interpretation that was written by a Marxist called the Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, written by Charles Beard. So here's my story. Just to cut through all the details, what was the Constitution? It was a second American Revolution, and the guys who pulled it off committed treason because they were sworn to. Many of them were members of the old Congress, and they were sworn to protect the old Constitution. So what they did is they got together because they were committing treason. They met behind closed doors in Philadelphia in 1787, and they swore that no one would ever say what was it was the opposite of transparency. They swore that no one would ever reveal what was said by anybody in this Constitutional Convention. A promise that was kept except by one person who broke it because he got mad. George Washington broke it one time with good cause. Everybody else kept it. And so the notes on the convention were not so do you have a question?
Madison didn't keep his promise. He kept notes.
Oh, but they weren't published until he died.
But he wasn't supposed to write them down.
Oh yeah, he could. Well, he wasn't supposed to? I didn't know that. Somebody else had notes. Because, anyway, Washington actually wanted to hammer Madison, and he knew about those notes. And Madison was doing some bad stuff, and in 1794, Washington went public. Because Madison changed this, but anyway. They did this in secret. The big thing is they did this in secret for a good reason. And so what did they do? Short thing is the creditors of the government took over the government. They basically took over the government. So they did some things in 1787, and they did some things in 1790 when the first Congress. So here's what they did. So think about whether Ronald Reagan would have liked this if he was there at the time. Ignoring the fact that Ronald Reagan, when he was your age, was a left-winger, and when he was, my age, he was whatever you call it. He was a fiscal conservative, I guess. Okay, so what they did is they did the following thing. They took away two things from the states and put them in the central government. Two critical things. One is the ability to regulate trade. The states could no longer regulate trade. Taxes on exports are prohibited in the U.S. Constitution. Import taxes can be levied only by the center. So guess what? Why'd they do that? Because they wanted to be able to retaliate against the British, and now they could. That's going to bring attention in a minute. So then here's the second thing they did. They gave the central government the monopoly on the tariff. Only the central government could levy tariff, and that's the big tax raisers. So that's what they did. So now the state governments have had their regulatory power taken away and their tax power taken away. And then here's the next deal. In the first Congress, and it was widely understood they would do this, the first Secretary of State is a guy named Alexander Hamilton. He's 33 years old. He read about 4 or 5 books in economics. He read them while he was a soldier. He was chief of staff of Washington. He was reading economics part-time, and he thought about what he read. And so in 1790, he writes a report on public credit, which he gives to the Congress, and he lays out, this is very transparent, he lays out what he's going to do. So here's what he does. What he's going to do is the federal government is going to bail out completely all the states. It's going to assume 100% of the state debts. This is called an assumption. So all this debt, so the U.S. government began with a huge bailout. So this is not about Europe. And so why did he do this? Okay, why did he do this? And furthermore, so he does 2 things. He's going to levy the tariff, and start raising revenues. So he's got this tax. He's going to start raising it. So he gets a tax increase through the first Congress. It passes it, and they start raising revenues. So remember I told you the amount of revenues the central government is raising rises to like around 2% of GDP. Doesn't sound like a big number. It's a big number there. And then what they're going to do with this revenue is they're going to use half of it to service the government debt. That's the plan. And he's open about it. This is what we're going to do. We're going to make good on those promises. And then the next thing he does, as I said, he nationalizes all the state debt. And he says why. He wants to convert the creditors of those state governments into creditors of the federal government, because these are important people. So they will then advocate that the government impose sufficient tariffs to raise the revenues to fund the debt. So look what he's doing. He's doing political. This guy knows political economy. He's saying he wants to rearrange. He wants to make the moneyed interests advocates of a strong central government that's going to tax enough to service their debt. So, what do you think happened to that debt that was at 10 cents on the dollar? What does he want to pay it at? No haircuts. He wants to fund it at par. He wants to fund it at par. And so he's going to use the Hansen asset pricing equation. To fund it at par, he's got to raise taxes. So Lars is a brilliant economist, very innovative, but Hamilton didn't know any math, and he knew the equation. So that's amazing, and he did, because he talks like he knows. You read the report on public credit, which you can get for 99 cents on Amazon. You read this and you say, how in the hell did that guy know that? So when Lars was 23 years old, he was studying math at the University of Minnesota like hell. When Hamilton was 23 years old, he had a gun and he was shooting at the British. So how did he learn this? Anyway, that's a miracle. That's a miracle. Anyway, so now fairness. Okay, fairness. So Madison, so this is in the congressional debates, and you can read it in Hamilton's report. Madison says the following: wait a minute. This is not fair. Paying this debt is not fair. So think about whether there's anything new under the sun. I have a friend, by the way, Savannah Lars. He says every time he hears somebody say fair, he gets really nervous. Because usually they're trying to get something for themselves or some friend of theirs. And they're trying to get it from you. That's what he says. I'm not saying that's, maybe he's paranoid. Okay, so here's what Madison said. Wait a minute. This is not fair. Why is it not fair? Look, okay, Will bought this debt in 1778 at par. You sold it to Lars a few years later. You kind of got a little queasy. You sold it to him for 50 cents in the dollar. And he sold it to Grace for 20 cents on the dollar. And she's got it now.
And she's going to get par.
She's going to get par. And Madison says, and actually the strings are more than it. He says, that's not fair. He says, that's completely not fair. He said, what she should get is 20 cents on the dollar. And I'm not going to be able to do the math, but Madison could. He's going to get 20 cents on the dollar, and then we're going to go find Lars, and we're going to give you, you already got, this is where the math's hard. You already got 20. We're going to give you 30. Now we're going to go find you. You already got 50. We're going to give you 50. It's all going to add up to 100. And that's fair. No capital gains and no capital losses. And so somebody could say, wow, there's some bookkeeping involved. But Madison said, no, don't worry, we can do this. And he actually had some, he actually kind of, maybe you could have with all these records. Okay, so that's kind of an attractive argument to somebody. So here's what Hamilton says. This is, by the way, this was important then, and think whether it's important now if you follow things in Europe. Hamilton says, wait a minute. The first thing is, why do we want to create this debt? He says, the reason, and he says, he's answering a fundamental question. There's two questions that Hamilton is confronting. Two questions. First, two fundamental questions which the United States was confronting and which certain other places are confronting now, including the United States. Should a government pay its debts? Should a central government pay its debts? You guys are going to have to decide that.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. I'm glad you say that. Because a substantial fraction are to me. Come back to that. So then the second thing is, should a central government bail out the debts of subordinate governments? No. Who said that? Okay, he said no. Okay. Hamilton said yes on both, and he gave reasons. First thing is, he said, why should a central government pay its debts? He said, why? Because it may want to borrow again. And it wants to establish a reputation vis-a-vis its potential creditors that it's going to pay its debts, even if it's painful. And why does he want to do that? It's because he thinks that it may be a good idea for the government to smooth its expenditures and taxes. And when there may be emergencies and there may be opportunities that come up where it would be a really good deal if you could borrow. And how are you going to establish a good reputation? Well, Hamilton said, you know, by doing something hard and honoring your old debt. That's his first reason. Second reason is, should you bail out subordinate governments? So he said yes. Oh, and there were various excuses given. And the reason he said, so why do you want to do that? Why should he bail out Georgia? And his reason is, he wants the guys who are Georgia debt holders to become advocates of a strong central government. Don't think of Europe right now. He wants them to become advocates of a strong central government. And that's his reason. Okay, so now he does this. So what he does is he creates a reputation. Okay, so now there's some modern papers on reputation, about how you carry off reputations. Some created by guys in this department, some elsewhere. So that's the question is, reputation with whom? So he's creating a reputation with federal creditors, but he's also creating a reputation with the states. They bailed them out once. The United States government is born in a big bailout. Our framers bailed out all the states. Yeah.
But it was like 20 or 30 years later at the next recession in America when the states built up a bunch of debt. That time the central government said, no, we will not bail you out. And they did that to teach them to be fiscally responsible. The first time was to build political power. The second time was to teach them fiscal responsibility.
Cool.
Did you steal your punchline?
Oh, of course. Yeah, he stole, which I really like. So where did you learn that?
New York Times article a couple years ago.
Okay. So let's pursue that. Okay. So that's where I want to go. Do you know about any other bailouts? Okay. So so this is how the United States happened at the beginning, and there's these two reputations. And now we're going to come to your thing eventually. So so kind of what happened? The Federalists made this stick. That's what they did. They used the tariff. The debt goes from deep discount. Oh, what? Okay. Let me come back. So let's come back to this discrimination thing. So how does Hamilton argue against Madison on the discrimination? So he says, wait a minute. The first thing is, I want this debt to be paid off. I don't really care about that old debt holders. The only reason I care about them is there's going to be reputational effects that are going to affect prospective debt holders. And I want to have an effect on those guys. If I want to do that, I want this debt to be something that's going to be tradable at par, and you can turn it over. And this discrimination scheme is going to wreak havoc with that. It's going to kill the liquidity of the debt. He makes that argument much better. Beautiful English, beautiful logic, in just a few words. The second thing he says, so now he's just kind of, it's like a fight. He's knocked Madison down. Hamilton's like, and he says, by the way, let's talk about fairness. Okay, so you lost faith in the U.S. government, and you bailed out, and you gave it to Lars. He lost faith, gave it to her. She bought it. So you doubted whether you were ever going to be paid. She bought it because she thought it might be paid. She was speculating on this being paid. And we're going to take away, we're going to penalize her for having faith in the government, and we're going to reward you for bailing out. We're going to insure you. And he says, that's stupid. It doesn't sound like fair. Anyway, you read that. It's an argument that continues. Okay. So have you read about, so you've heard about the politics now is contentious, but it's nothing like it was in the 1790s. What Jefferson and Madison said about George Washington and Hamilton was truly scurrilous in every way. And Jefferson actually hired an editor, put him on a State Department payroll to write nasty things about President Washington. In the meantime, he's very friendly to Washington in his face. Okay, so this is Jefferson. And furthermore, and the guy he hired was a total sleazeball. So much of a sleazeball that he tried to blackmail Jefferson 10 years later about a little story about Jefferson having children with a slave. And Jefferson thought he was bluff. Anyway, the origin of that story is this guy who Jefferson originally paid to. So these guys are really being nasty to each other, our framers. Anyway, that's the story. So what were they being nasty about? And they were basically, Jefferson and Madison are calling Washington and Hamilton traitors. So what was that about? It was about the following. Remember I told you Britain, our framers wanted the United States to have the ability to levy tariffs and regulate trade so they could retaliate against the British. So now they have the power. And here's what the Federalists did under Washington and Hamilton. They levied tariffs, but they abstained from retaliating against the British. And the British did a bunch of stuff that was really provocative, and which Hamilton and Washington they just turned the other cheek, and Madison and Jefferson said, stand up and be men and retaliate. impose embargoes. You know, you got the power, let's do it. And Hamilton and Washington said, wait a minute, let's do the math. Who's our main trading partner, despite this discrimination? Well, 80% of our trade is with Britain. We're taxing that trade, and we're using those taxes to service our debt. So the whole scheme of earning a reputation for servicing your debt is contingent on these tariff revenues coming in. Okay, so Jefferson and Madison, who strong point is not economics, in my opinion, say who cares? Furthermore, who cares that much about the creditors? And who cares that much about U.S. credit? We shouldn't be borrowing anyway. So there's a huge conflict about this. And the conflict is about, should the United States retaliate? And if you look at the 1790s, when the peace-loving Federalists have power, they sustain a power that we protect our tariff revenues. And then watch what happens when the so-called Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. They get in, and then they start experimenting with using the tariff to retaliate. And in my opinion, they almost destroy the United States. They get us into the War of 1812. Read about there's almost a civil war. Read about the embargo that Jefferson and Madison put on in the 1880s. But it's all about what are you going to do with this power to regulate trade, given the fact that your main source of taxes, which you're using to service the debt, is coming from preserving trade. That is a central issue of the 1790s and the 17. And it explains, for example, you'll see, it'll make sense of the following. Jefferson and Madison are always calling they're always calling Washington, they're always calling Washington an Angleman, meaning he's really an English guy. He wants to be a king. He loves the English because he won't retaliate against their trade. So think that through. By the way, Washington and Hamilton fought in the Revolutionary War against the British. Jefferson and Madison chose not to. But nevertheless, these slurs were put on. So anyway, that's pretty exciting. So that's how this country started with the big bailout. Now, as you said, let's fast forward. Oh, by the way, currency union. So we created a federal fiscal union not because we wanted a currency union with anybody or with these, because we were already on a currency union with Spain. And we sort of stayed on one. So if you look at, you cut through the details and you look at, supposedly Hamilton set up a U.S. monetary system and he created a U.S. dollar. But if you look at the details, he created a U.S. dollar only after we had funded the debt. And if you look at what a U.S. dollar was, it's a carbon copy of a Spanish dollar. It has exactly the same amount of... So we just basically pegged to the Spanish dollar. And the Spanish couldn't care less whether we did that. We weren't in a fiscal union with them. We were in a fiscal union with ourselves. Okay. So now, as you said, what is your name? Say again? Okay. So Mr. Singleton stole my punchline. So it's like this. So I'll provide some color to your... I'll just remind you, about 85%, I think, or 75 or 85% of the initial debt at the time of the bailout is owed to U.S. citizens. Okay, so store that. So do you know what the 11th Amendment of the Constitution says? Do you know what the First Amendment says? Okay, okay, good. Because everyone knows the first, but they don't know about the 11th. But the 11th is important. It's a very sleazy amendment. So here's the deal. So we create this union, the new Constitution. Hamilton and Washington get us the ability to borrow, and we use it because an opportunity comes up in 1803. You know what that is. Napoleon offers to sell us enough land to double the size of the United States. We don't have the dough. We borrow easily in the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so things are going on. Now we have you advance to the 1810s and after the War of 1812, and the 1820s and the 1830s, and you have a federal government that has the ability to tax, and we actually pay off our debt. Our debt's actually running down. So now the question is, and we have these tariff revenues coming in. Now the question is, what should we use them for? Okay. So now the question arises, what kind of fiscal union should we have? Okay, so Jefferson and Madison and Monroe all want to use some of the revenues to finance internal improvements, railroads, canals, roads. But they think it's unconstitutional. They think it's unconstitutional for the federal government to finance public goods unless they go across all the states. So there's a sequence of vetoes of these public projects. Many of these public projects are risky. Of these public works projects, railroads, canals, are risky. They won't attract enough private funds. So what happens is state governments start financing them. Okay, so do you know the following? State governments now, like Illinois, have balanced budget requirements in their constitutions. So you know that. State governments have to balance their budget. Why? Not because the federal government tells them to, but because their own state constitutions do. At the beginning, they had no such requirements. And they did not have those requirements until the 1840s. So then, here's what happens. In the 1820s and 1830s, state governments start running deficits, huge deficits, and they use them to finance canals and railroads. So they borrow and lend in turn to these these private railroad companies and so on. And the logic that they give is, see if you've heard logic like this recently. Logic like this is these projects are going to pay for themselves. These are infrastructure projects, and the way they're going to pay for themselves is, well, first they're going to cause land values to go up around them. They're going to cause increased commerce. Tax revenues in the states are going to go up, and they're going to generate the revenues to service the bonds. So investors in these bonds were convinced by these arguments. And who were the investors in these bonds? Many of them were British. 70% of them were British. Okay, so this is going to be related to Mr. Singleton's point. They were British. Okay, so there's a... oh, and why would the British, if you buy a bond and you apply the Hansen-Singleton formula for evaluating it, one thing you want to know how good the promises are. So the first thing you notice is you go read the U.S. Constitution, and state governments are obligated to pay their creditors. It's in the U.S. Constitution. So that looks pretty good. Furthermore, if you're a British guy, the federal government has paid all of its debt and has a good reputation achieved by Hamilton and Washington for paying its debt, so it's a good creditor. And one final thing, we began with a humongous bailout of the state governments. So that's good too. You've kind of got an implicit guarantee. Okay, but the 11th Amendment to the Constitution, I think it was passed in 1791 or 1792. What it says is that if you're a creditor of a state government, you cannot enforce, and you don't live in that state, you can't enforce a claim against the state except in a state court. You can't do it in a federal court. And if you're a foreigner, that's true. And if you have a debt against Georgia, go to the Georgia court. And the Georgia court's going to say, too bad. You don't live in Georgia. Okay, so people in Britain forgot, they didn't read that, but they should have. They didn't read that little thing. Okay, so guess what happened? There's a financial crisis in the 1830s, and a bunch of these state bonds go belly up. Okay, now as Mr. Singleton said, there's no problem. A bunch of the creditors go to the federal government, the Congress, and they say, you bailed us out last time, bail us out again. And there's a big debate. Okay, so then the grounds of this debate, if you read this debate, what they do is, as Mr. Singh said, they don't bail them out. Bonds go belly up. And now what happens is the states get a bad reputation vis-a-vis creditors, and the federal government gets a bad reputation for about a generation. Even during the Civil War. This happens in 1840. At the beginning of the Civil War, the U.S. has trouble placing debt in Britain. Guess why? The British creditors are still sore about not being bailed out. So right after that, a majority of the state constitutions are rewritten, and they're rewritten to prohibit the states from running any deficits. So they have to have a balanced budget every year, which is a bad idea. It's actually a bad idea because you'd like the ability to borrow and to smooth taxes, but you can't do it. And you can't do it because it was, you don't trust yourself. So, so you've seen in recent years the bindingness of this restriction. The reason teachers are being laid off is because, for this reason. Anyway, so now have a so now the question is, so I asked at the beginning, so do you think it was a good idea? Oh, one other thing. Why did they bail him out the first time and not the second time? Say again?
Because the creditors were American?
That's what I think. First time I think the creditors are American, and they were important Americans who Hamilton wanted, and this time they don't vote. So think about that a little bit, and ask who's buying lots of American debt now. This is going to be something your generation gets to think about. We don't hold it in. Yeah, that's a good question. Who's holding European debt? But this is inflammatory stuff to talk about. But okay, so okay. Okay, so this theme. Okay, so was it a good idea or a bad idea? So so I'll put words in your mouth. The guys who would say it was a good idea they didn't bail him out the second time are saying this was a pivotal moment in the design of the U.S. constitutional system and federalism. So you guys know about moral hazard, right? You should, because you're participating in creating it big time by too big to fail. And it's going to have consequences for you. But the consequence here was the federal government and the Congress said a state is not too big to fail. And the reason it said that is if it had bailed them out that time, it would have had to do one of two things. Get ready to bail them out repeatedly, probably more often and bigger, or take control of them. So if you're gonna offer to bail somebody out, because of the adverse incentives that creates for them to be profligate, if you're going to underwrite their profligacy, you're going to have to go in there and regulate it. And if you'd regulated it, that would take sovereignty, what sovereignty remains from the states away from them. So this is a pivotal thing where, then the federal government said, they didn't say rewrite your constitutions. They said you're on your own. So they reordered things. And that had drastic effect on American federalism. There's a really good 19th century book by a man named Henry Carter Adams. It's called Public Debts, and it talks about the ramifications of this for the division within states and municipalities and local regions. So what he points out is a growth in federalism due to this, where these public goods, they weren't going to be financed by states anymore. And if they were truly local public goods, what was created was local districts where the benefits and the people who benefited in tax and were taxed kind of were matched up. If you look at a time series of state and local government debt in the 19th century, and the part that's due to the state and the part that's due to and government activity to the localities, it moves big time. The states become much less important, and the localities and counties become much more important in the 19th century. And it's all connected with this. There was another big default, a range of defaults. And this deserves to be explored more. It's kind of deplorable. I'll just indicate this, because I asked you if there were... So you guys know about the Civil War?
Yes.
Okay, you know about the Civil War.
A little bit.
Okay. Have you ever read the 14th Amendment? You know what the 14th Amendment, I think it has 4 or 5 clauses. It's a noble amendment in what it does. But the last clause is about government debt. And what it says is, so you come out of the war, and the Confederacy has a bunch of debt. The individual states in the South have a bunch of debt, and the North has a bunch of debt. So what the 14th Amendment says is, first, the federal government debt is to be honored. And the Confederate debt and the debt of the states is not to be honored. Can't do it. So that's what the 14th Amendment said. Okay, so then after the Civil War, it's a really interesting period, the history of which has been revised in your time. So when I was your age, what we learned, Southerners, Confederates wrote the history, largely wrote the history of the Civil War. And so here's what I learned when I was your age. There was this period of Reconstruction where these nasty Northerners went in, and these poor white Southerners got hammered. And what happened was all these. I'm paraphrasing this. I'm going to attack it in a minute. And what happened was these Northern do-gooders went down south, and some of the Southern white guys, and they insisted that black people have full civil rights, and black people could vote, and they wouldn't let some Confederates vote. So there were these state governments that elected these quote-unquote ignorant black people to Congress. They weren't ignorant, by the way. Lots of them were quite literate and impressive. So the Union Army went in there, and they suppressed the Ku Klux Klan, and they protected black rights. They stopped white people from going on, violating civil rights. Anyway, so that's what happened. And then what happened is these Southern, this is called Reconstruction governments, they issued state bonds to try to rebuild railroads and stuff. And then what happened was, various things happened. After 10 years, this experiment in social engineering is ended, and the white Southerners take control. And that happens in 1876. Reconstruction's over. By the way, you've heard Ulysses S. Grant is the worst U.S. president. Guess why? Because Southerners wrote that story. And Ulysses S. Grant is the guy who first he beat Robert E. Lee. He thought slavery was bad. You read it, he signed a Civil Rights Act in 1875 that was much better than Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Act, by the way. So this was a guy, that's what he stood for, but he's the worst U.S. president because of the story about Reconstruction. So what happened was, so this story is being revised drastically for reasons you could see. But what happened was there was a bunch of government debt that these black Republican governments had issued in the South. And when these white guys took over, in addition to opposing Jim Crow, they defaulted on all the debt. So that's another story. And that had consequences for economic development in the South in various ways. So the end of Reconstruction, that's the opposite of a bailout. It's a big default, and that had consequences. So kind of the theme of bailouts and fiscal crises being associated with revolutions keeps cropping up. I've talked enough. So does any of this remind somebody of Europe? And where's Europe now? And what's the project? And so if anybody asks you, So what Europe has now, it has a central government that reminds you more of the Articles of Confederation than the U.S. Constitution. It has no power to tax, basically very little power to tax. It has decision making by consensus, small, which is a really bad way to make decisions, by the way. Read Cournot, chapter 9. Everyone reads chapter 7 and 8 at Cournot. Read chapter 9. It's a proof that consensus decision making is bad. So there's a project. So they don't have a fiscal union. And now the question is, if they want to have a monetary union, do they need a fiscal union? And why do some people want a fiscal union? And does this have anything to do with some of the issues we've talked about? And so I talked with a friend of mine about all this stuff. And so I'll tell you something that you're not supposed to say in public. Okay? So I tell him this story. We talk about this story about George Washington rewriting the Constitution. How they. So if you kind of think of it, that's a political revolution. Where by a revolution you mean. So what's the Constitution? To my mind, Constitution is what we as economists call an environment. You know what I mean? So I don't know. You go home and talk to your aunt, and she says, "Oh, I keep reading this stuff. An economic agent. What's an economic agent?" And you say, "Oh, at the University of Chicago, I learned an economic agent is a constrained optimization problem," which is true. Then the second thing is, she says, "Oh, I took physics, and I know what an equilibrium is. What's an equilibrium? I hear you mumbling about equilibrium. What's an equilibrium in economics?" And you say, an equilibrium is a collection of economic agents. And remember, Aunt Jane, I just told you what an economic agent is. It's a collection of constrained optimization problems that are mutually consistent. Good. She says, okay, then environment. What's an environment? It's a description of a collection of economic agents. I told you what that was. And it's a description of who chooses what when. So that's cool. That includes Nash equilibrium, competitive equilibrium. That's cool. Okay, so an economic environment. So if you ask what a revolution is, it's a reordering of who chooses what when. So that's what. Think about what Hamilton and Jefferson did. They the tariff is not chosen by 13 guys, like zillions of 13 legislatures. It's chosen by one legislature. That's when. Trade is regulated. So they're reordering. They're completely reordering the who chooses what when. And that reordering was done in the United States in 1787 because of a fiscal crisis. And there was another set of revolution in virtually every state in the United States in 1840 when the federal government failed to bail them out. They rewrote the Constitution about who chooses what when. And most spectacular example of this is France in 1789. If you read history and you try to penetrate why the king in 1789 called these States General together, it was all about resolving a fiscal crisis. And it was the only way he thought he could do it, and it resolved it okay. And you can proliferate examples like this. So that's why it's kind of scary or exciting. So my friend, I was talking to this over beers. My friend said, Tim Cogga says, "Okay, I get the point." So I have two questions for you. He's kind of a wise guy. Two questions. Does Europe need a Hamilton? That's the easy one. Oh no, of course not, because they can go read Hamilton. He wrote it down. It's 20 pages. Just read it and think about it. Here's the next question. Does Europe need or does it have a George Washington? So that's one not to be touched with a 10-foot pole. Because they've had them. They don't now, but they've had them. It's not, you know what I mean? Because the project to create a federal Europe is not a new one, it's an old one. So you don't know who I'm talking about? Yeah, that's kind of blunt. Yeah, that's who I was thinking about. The Napoleon, or or Hitler, or Kaiser Wilhelm. That's a project. Those were all a project to create a fiscal union in Europe, and fiscal policy was a big part of all those guys. Trade and fiscal policy. Eastern Europe, there was a project to create a fiscal union. Okay, so it's an old project. The reason that's kind of that's both correct and incorrect is this time the project is led by not. This isn't stuff you say in public. It's not led by bad Germans. It's led by good Germans. and you know what I mean? What I mean by that is. Actually, if you go back right at the beginning of the creation of the euro, the guys who created it are guys who don't trust other Germans. Seriously, they still don't trust other Germans. They're kind of, and what they want to do is they want to bind Germany to Europe in peaceful ways, even at cost to Germany. That's the project. That was the project to create a European central bank, and that's a noble project. But if anybody asks you what's going to happen to the euro or what should happen to the euro, first, what should happen to the euro, any economist worth his salt should not answer that question. And the reason is, what should happen is there's going to be huge winners and losers all over the place. So the only honest way to answer that is to say Greece should not leave the euro because I own a bunch of Greek bonds. Okay? Or you say Greece should leave the euro because I own a bunch of taxes in Greece. That's all. Anyway. And then what will happen is the politics. You got to know a lot more about politics than I do. Talk about this.
So it looks like we only have about 5 minutes left. So does anyone in the audience have any questions to follow up?
So Ulysses S. Grant was blamed for the Southern governments defaulting on their debt and not paying it off?
Well, that's not what I'm saying.
But the Southerners blamed him for that? Why were they upset?
The Southerners, okay, so you can't aggregate across people. Southern creditors were upset. Southern taxpayers weren't. And so it's a really interesting incident. Now the thing I'm claiming, there's a great book by an historian, a wonderful historian called Robert McPherson. He's a historian of the U.S. Civil War, and this thing is called. Okay, I can't pronounce this right. The Mighty Scourge, Grace, Mighty Scourge, and it's a set of essays about the historiography of the Civil War. And he makes this case that that the Southerners had a huge impact on the writing of Southern history. Like the thing. So you may have heard. So there was a thesis called the Phillips thesis that Civil War was a waste because slavery would have collapsed on its own for economic reasons. So Robert Fogel said, "Oh yeah." Actually, let's take that argument seriously. So it was economists that destroyed that argument. But that was a popular argument even when I was in school. So this McPherson line is, he goes through and documents a lot of stuff you probably learned. We sing folk songs about Jesse James. You think Jesse James is a good guy because he's a rebel? Like he's a Confederate murderer. And he's raised to a folk hero. So he documents that. And the people that engineered Reconstruction were those were advocates of civil rights. That's all they wanted to do, and they were caricatured in a really bad way. And Grant was the leader of them. I love that story. I love that story because my great-great-grandfather fought in the Union Army, and he was a major with the 3rd Wisconsin Volunteer Cavalry, and he fought Jesse James. And my grandfather taught me that Ulysses S. Grant was a hero, and Jesse James was a bastard. Anyway, but that's my problem. Yeah.
We probably, oh, yeah.
So when the states collapsed in the 1840s, we were in a currency union already at that point. And the currency didn't collapse.
Yeah, you're correct.
This other government continued to go on, the federal government continued to go on, and 20 years later was able to raise enough debt to fight the Civil War.
Yep.
So do you think that if, turning to Europe, if there were certain defaults within the euro currency zone, that it wouldn't bring down, because everybody keeps talking about this domino effect that's going to happen if that happened with the banks before, and that people talking about here in the currency.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's kind of a little bit overblown?
So it's a great question, and the answer is I don't know. So what your question gets at is, they could have set up the currency union differently than they did. They didn't set out the rules clearly. So what they could have said is, anybody who wants to can adopt the German mark, just like we adopted the Spanish dollar, but you're on your own. So the United States, we are in a currency union with Panama and in Zimbabwe. Did you know that? Zimbabwe uses the U.S. dollar now. We don't bail them out at all, and everyone understands that. So, but the situation now is, and you can see why this was created, is partial steps have been taken to bail out Greece and Spain and Italy, and no one knows who the ultimate, but so it's not clear how extensive these bailouts are. So what people are doing is they're speculating on how extensive the bailouts are, and that sets up a situation where there could be runs. These are great things. It's a great time to be. Some people, actually, you read stuff like this. Oh, the financial crisis has proved that economics and mathematical economics and economic theory is useless. You'll see that written all over. Just the opposite. It creates, there's great problems to study. We know a lot about some of them. We know a lot more than that comment makes, because we understand a lot about runs and crises, but we don't understand everything. So it's a great time for, you guys have picked a great major. So like if this were a thing in the classics, and we were talking about like how beautiful Aristotle is. Don't get me wrong, I love Aristotle, but you'd be talking about, well, what am I going to do now in terms of a job? But the financial crisis and other things have created lots of opportunities for you in terms of jobs in the private sector and in academia, and that's great.
I think we're out of time, but thank you so much.
Sure.